You are underwater. The marble presses cold against your skin. Salt burns the back of your throat. Your lungs scream, but you've learned to silence them. Above the surface, through the distorted lens of water, you see the shape of him draped in imperial purple, reclining on marble steps carved into living rock. His fingers move, a signal. You know what it means. You've been trained. You glide forward, a little fish performing tricks for the most powerful man in the world. The man who can decide with a gesture whether you surface to breathe or stay down until darkness takes you. This is not a bathhouse. This is not recreation. This is survival measured in held breath and learned obedience. And you are 8 years old. Before we go any further, I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching this from? It amazes me that a story this dark, from 2,000 years ago, still reaches people across every continent. If you're finding value in these histories, a like or subscribe means the world. The island is Capri, a jewel of volcanic rock rising from the Tyrrhenian Sea, 12 kilometers off the coast of Italy. Crystal waters, limestone cliffs, views that make the soul ache with beauty. But in 26 AD, when Tiberius, Julius Caesar Augustus, withdrew from Rome to make this paradise his permanent residence, Capri became something else entirely. It became a stage 4 acts so grotesque that 3 separate Roman historians, Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio, felt compelled to document them. Despite the political danger of recording an emperor's private depression, the villa complex he built still stands. Villa Jovis, the house of Jupiter, perched on a promontory, like a stone witness to everything that transpired within its walls. And what transpired, according to contemporary accounts corroborated by archaeological evidence, was a systematic machinery of abuse that turned imperial bureaucracy into an instrument of cruelty. The procurement began on Italy's coasts. Imperial agents carrying sealed documents bearing the emperor's authority moved through fishing villages and port towns with methodical precision. They were looking for something specific. Boys between 8 and 14 years old, strong swimmers, physically attractive by Roman standards, and critically able to hold their breath for extended periods. Suetonius, writing his Lives of the 12 Caesars with access to imperial archives and eyewitness testimony, describes the process without sentiment or euphemism. These were not voluntary recruitments. Fathers were presented with official mandates and a sum of money. The transaction had the veneer of legitimacy. Your son will serve the emperor, an honor for any family. But refusal carried consequences that no one wanted to test. Tacitus hints at what happened to those who resisted. Detainment, intimidation, the quiet use of power to crush dissent before it could form. The criteria were repeated across multiple accounts with disturbing consistency, suggesting these were not random selections but institutionally defined requirements. Roman naval commanders and local procurators facilitated the transfers. Ships departed with cargo manifests that listed human beings alongside wine and grain. The boy, let's call him by the only name history gives children like him. Pure, simply boy made landfall under armed guard. The dock was purpose-built for imperial arrivals, watched by sentries who recorded names and ages in ledgers that would later be referenced by chroniclers. He was led through cool corridors that smelled of limestone, olive oil, and something medicinal he couldn't identify. The first stage was evaluation. Greek physicians trained in Alexandria and employed by the imperial household conducted examinations that were clinical in their thoroughness. They measured lung capacity, tested flexibility, inspected teeth and limbs, the way one might assess livestock. Those who passed received better clothing and were assigned quarters near the villa's extensive pool complex. Those who failed simply vanished from the record reassigned. The documents would say, though to where and for what purpose, no chronicle bothers to specify. But here's what makes this story particularly chilling. The abuse wasn't chaotic or impulsive. It was organized with the same administrative competence Rome used to build aqueducts and maintain legions. The villa's architecture tells part of the story that words cannot. Modern archaeological surveys have mapped Villa Jovis in exhaustive detail, its cisterns, its bathing chambers, its subterranean passages cut directly into volcanic rock. These weren't decorative features. They were functional infrastructure designed to facilitate prolonged aquatic rituals in complete privacy. The pools varied in depth and temperature, connected by underwater passages that required breath control to navigate. Marble absorbed sound. The thick walls and isolated location meant that what happened in these chambers stayed in these chambers. Roman engineering, that great triumph of practical genius, had been bent toward creating perfect conditions for sustained, systematic violation. Suetonius uses a specific term that survives in the Latin text, pervuli, little fishes. He describes how Tiberius trained these boys to swim between his thighs while he bathed, performing acts that the historian records with disturbing specificity. The emperor called them his little fishes, and the name itself is an act of ehumanization, reducing children to aquatic performers, stripping away personhood with a diminutive that sounds almost affectionate but functions as pure erasure. These weren't spontaneous moments of impulse. They were scheduled events requiring preparation, attendance, and documentation. Household accounts referenced by later historians who had access to imperial records show allocations for specialized personnel, for medicinal oils, for the maintenance of the pool systems. This was abuse integrated into the daily operations of governance, normalized through repetition and bureaucratic routine. The training was sophisticated and deliberate. Boys were taught to hold their breath for progressively longer periods, 2 minutes, then 3, then 5. Roman athletic trainers, some of whom had worked with gladiators and professional swimmers, applied their expertise to this grotesque purpose. The children learned specific movements, choreographed gestures timed to the emperor's breathing and position in the water. They practiced in silence because noise was punished immediately. Older boys, survivors of previous years, taught the new arrivals the unwritten rules: never make eye contact unless summoned, never cry out regardless of pain, never show anything on your face that resembles fear or disgust. These rules weren't created by children. They were passed down through a shadow pedagogy of survival. Institutional knowledge accumulated through years of systematic abuse. And here's a detail that should make us pause. Some of these boys were given education. They learned to read, they copied texts, they received training in skills that might seem merciful, until you realize this dual life of learning and violation was itself a form of psychological control. It created a perverse normalcy, a routine that made the horror seem like just another aspect of imperial service. You studied grammar in the morning, you performed in the pools in the afternoon. The juxtaposition was intentional. It taught compliance by making the unthinkable mundane. Punishments were calibrated with bureaucratic precision. Physical beatings occurred, but more effective were the psychological sanctions. Boys who displeased the emperor were isolated in underground chambers where water dripped with metronomic regularity, where echo warped sound into something alien. They were deprived of sleep, subjected to extreme temperatures, cut off from any human contact that might offer comfort. Some were reassigned, that administrative euphemism again, and simply disappeared from the household rosters. No trials, no formal charges, just the quiet exercise of imperial authority to erase a human being from the record. When their usefulness ended, or their resistance became inconvenient, Tacitus notes that many people vanished during Tiberius's reign without any documentation of their fate, swallowed by a system that had learned to destroy evidence as efficiently as it kept accounts. The emperor's physical decline made everything worse. In his later years, chroniclers describe Tiberius suffering from chronic coughs, painful skin conditions, and gastrointestinal ailments that left him in constant discomfort. Rather than moderating his demands, illness intensified them. His physicians devised elaborate bathing rituals meant to soothe his symptoms, longer sessions, more complex procedures, treatments that required the sustained participation of boys who could be submerged for dangerous lengths of time. Suetonius remarks that as Tiberius aged, he became more reclusive and more exacting, as if the erosion of his body required greater compensations to achieve the same sensory endpoints. The children's bodies were consumed as medicine for an emperor's failing flesh. The villa's topography created its own form of control. Steep cliffs dropped hundreds of feet to the sea below. There were no easy escape routes. Guard towers commanded sight lines over every approach. But some boys still chose the cliffs over continued survival. There's a detail that survives in the historical record, mentioned almost in passing. Multiple instances of household members found dead below the western terraces, bodies recovered from the rocks and waves. These weren't accidents. They were the final refusals of children who could no longer bear what was being asked of their bodies and souls. Suicide as the only available form of agency. The villa's beauty, those breathtaking views that made Capri famous, was also a reminder of the prison's absolute boundaries. You could see freedom, you could see the mainland, you could never reach it. Meanwhile, back in Rome, whispers circulated. Senators exchanged coded letters. Equestrians spoke carefully in private villas. Everyone knew something was happening on Capri, but the emperor's power made open accusations suicidal. Tacitus records the political atmosphere of these years with bitter clarity. Prosecutions for treason multiplied, informers flourished, fear became the currency of governance. Tiberius's physical withdrawal from Rome didn't diminish his authority, it concentrated it. He ruled through intermediaries, through written commands, through a network of freedmen and agents who wielded power without accountability. The abuses on Capri and the political terror in Rome weren't separate phenomena. They were two expressions of the same pathology: absolute power unchecked by institutional restraint or moral consequence. In 31 AD, Sejanus fell. Lucius Aelius Sejanus, the Praetorian prefect, who had consolidated enormous power while Tiberius remained distant, was executed on charges of conspiracy. The purge that followed sent shockwaves through the imperial household. Men who had facilitated the emperor's desires suddenly found themselves vulnerable. Some were executed, others fled. The machine of abuse that had operated with such bureaucratic smoothness began to show cracks, not because anyone cared about the children, but because the political foundations supporting that machine had shifted. This is how systemic cruelty often ends, not through moral awakening, but through the collapse of the power structures that made it possible. When Tiberius died in 37 AD, Villa Jovis was sealed rapidly. Tacitus and Suetonius both mention the speed with which the household was disbanded. Servants scattered, documents were burned or hidden. The new Emperor Caligula faced a choice: expose the full extent of his predecessor's crimes and risk destabilizing the institution of emperorship itself, or allow a strategic silence that preserved continuity while permitting enough scandal to leak for political purposes. He chose the middle path. Enough was revealed to damage Tiberius's reputation. Enough was suppressed to protect the broader machinery of imperial governance. The boys, those who survived, were dispersed into other households, given small sums, occasionally granted freedom, but more often simply absorbed into new forms of servitude. Roman law offered them no recourse. They had been property serving the emperor's pleasure, and property has no standing to sue for damages. The psychological aftermath is documented in fragments that subsequent historians piece together. Some survivors exhibited what we would now recognize as severe trauma: withdrawal from social life, inability to form relationships, episodes of what Roman writers called melancholia, a darkness of spirit that wouldn't lift. Others became what their abuse had trained them to be: specialists in degradation who found employment in other elite households where their particular skills had market value. The cruelest outcome: the system that destroyed them also made conventional life impossible, trapping them in cycles of exploitation they'd been conditioned to accept as normal. A few disappeared into remote provinces, seeking anonymity. Most simply vanished from the historical record after brief mentions, their ultimate fates unknown and unrecorded. The three chroniclers who documented these events, Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio, wrote with different purposes but converging conclusions. Suetonius wanted to catalog vice with encyclopedic thoroughness. Tacitus sought to diagnose Rome's moral decay through the lens of individual corruption. Cassius Dio, writing in Greek centuries later, compiled administrative details that reinforced the systematic nature of what had occurred. None of them were writing for titillation, though their accounts are graphic when specificity matters. They were attempting to answer a historical question: how does absolute power corrupt not just individuals, but entire institutions? Capri was their answer. It was possible, they demonstrated through meticulous documentation, for an emperor to turn the entire apparatus of state procurement networks, naval transport, household administration, medical services, into machinery for sustained abuse. And it was possible for that machinery to operate year after year because everyone involved made the same calculation: obedience was safer than resistance. The ruins today are cleaned up for tourists. Guides speak of architectural marvels and panoramic views. The pools are described as luxury features of Roman villa design, and they were that. But they were also something else, something the polished tourism narrative doesn't quite capture. When you stand in Villa Jovis now and look at those cisterns carved into rock, when you trace the sight lines and measure the distances, you're seeing infrastructure designed for control and concealment. The beauty and the horror occupy the same physical space, impossible to separate. That's the uncomfortable truth about much of Rome's grandeur. It was built by an empire that commodified human beings with administrative efficiency. And what happened on Capri was an extreme expression of a system that saw people as resources to be exploited until they broke. There's no redemptive ending here, no moment where justice arrives or healing begins. The boys, called pervuli, little fishes, slipped through history, mostly unnamed and unmourned, visible only in the margins of texts written by men who wanted to shame an emperor, not to provide restitution to victims. The stones remain. The pools still hold water when it rains. Archaeological surveys continue to map the villa's features with increasing precision, and each new measurement confirms what the ancient sources described. This place was designed to facilitate what happened within it. We inherit this knowledge without any ability to undo what was done. What we're left with is a historical truth that challenges comfortable narratives about power and civilization. Rome built roads that connected continents, legal systems that influenced modern law, engineering marvels that still inspire awe. It also maintained mechanisms that turned children into instruments of imperial pleasure when those in authority deemed it useful. Both facts are true simultaneously. The grandeur and the grotesque are woven together so tightly that you cannot celebrate one without acknowledging the other. And perhaps that's the real legacy of Capri. Not the specific acts of one emperor, but the demonstration of what becomes possible when institutional power faces no meaningful constraint, when the machinery of state can be bent toward any purpose its masters desire, and when human beings are reduced to administrative categories in ledgers that survive longer than their names. The island keeps its secrets in stone. The water in those ancient pools reflects nothing but sky now, but the echoes remain in the chronicler's careful documentation. In the archaeological evidence that makes denial impossible, in the uncomfortable questions we're forced to ask about power, complicity, and the systems we build that make cruelty routine. Tiberius is gone. The empire that enabled him has fallen. But the capacity for institutions to normalize horror when authority demands it, that's the inheritance we still carry. The warning carved into every stone of Villa Jovis that we're still learning to read.